Hello, everybody. I see there's a lot of people just coming in. I see the numbers rising quite fast. So let's give it a minute just to give everybody the chance to enjoy this webinar from the beginning. So we'll wait for 1 minute before we get started. All right, I think we have quite a few participants already. So we have 190 people dialed in. That's roughly half of the number of registrations, but we don't want to punish the people that are on time. So let's get started. First of all, a big welcome to all of you. I'm really happy to see that there's so much interest in this webinar. Today we'll focus on the supply chain knock-on effects of the German Supply Chain Act. So obviously this is concerns not just German companies, but all companies that have business with German companies and also the extended supply chain. So this is what we will be focusing on today. My name is Francis Wimmer, Stakeholder Engagement Advisor at Amfori, and I'll be moderating this session today. Just to give a bit of background also on this webinar, this is the second in a series of webinars focusing on the obligations under the German Supply Chain Act and existing tools that you can use to comply with those obligations. It's co-hosted by Amfori and the German Partnership for Sustainable Textiles and supported by the German government's help desk for business and human rights. So we also have speakers from all three organizations here today. Just before we go into the agenda, a couple of housekeeping rules. So all the participants are muted. We have quite a few today, so in that sense, we also don't want any chaos, people speaking on top of each other. So you can raise your questions in the chat box on the Q&A function. The webinar will also be recorded, and we will be sharing the slides as well as a brief satisfaction survey afterwards. So if we can move to the next slide. So we'll be starting with an opening remarks from our president, Linda Krumjong. Very happy that you're here with us, Linda. Then after we will have the German government's help desk on business and human rights, Michaela Streibelt, presenting really the supply chain knock-on effects of the German Supply Chain Act. Then we'll enter into a Q&A. So please post your questions throughout the presentation, so we can then raise them during that session. And then afterwards we will have an overview from Erika Sock, our service and programs expert here at Amfori, as well as Isabel Reichenbach from the German Partnership for Sustainable Textiles, to give a bit of a glimpse of what we are offering as Amfori and the German PST respectively. And then again, we'll have a brief Q&A before we come to the closing remarks by Linda Schramme, the head at the office for the Partnership for Sustainable Textiles, German Partnership for Sustainable Textiles. So that's our agenda today. And I will leave it at that. I will hand over to Linda. Linda, please, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Francis, and thank you very much all for being on this webinar. I will try to keep my introduction short, but not too short, to make sure that we really capture it, say everything correctly. Let me start with explaining what amfori is. We are the leading business association for sustainable trade. We enable companies across the globe to operate successful and responsible business by helping them improve environmental, social, and governance performance of their value chains through robust due diligence, because that's what we do, robust due diligence. We believe in trade with purpose. We are amfori in a nutshell here. We were founded as the Foreign Trade Association in 1977, and amfori has therefore more than 40 years of experience in this space of trade and the space of responsible business conduct. amfori BECI was initiated in 2003 by a group of companies who were really, would say, the front runners, who were working to improve the social performance of their supply chain. So amfori BECI, almost 20 years young this year. When they realized that they were sourcing from the same factories or farms, they understood that, power of collaboration would mean that they would be able to avoid duplication, that they could use collective leverage to improve and introduce, say, positive changes here. As already said, this year we'll celebrate 20 years of amfori BECI, and over this period of time, our members have voluntarily committed to improve the supply chain, and as a result have, I would say, there's a wealth of practical experience on due diligence being assembled by them. Yes, we started working on social due diligence through amfori BECI, but we also have now environmental due diligence in place with amfori BEPI, because that is what we are required to do. We cannot be responsible businesses if we also do not focus on environmental considerations within the supply chain. Today, we have around 2,500 company members, and it is still true that the German membership is, you are still the largest community within amfori. And we have close to 30,000 business partners engaged in a broad offering, supporting companies and their business partners to meet their due diligence obligations. Advocacy, we cannot do without. It's always been one of our core products, and it's a critical component because it underpins what we are doing, because we would like to be legislation in favor of business, in favor of responsible business conduct. Therefore, we also were one of the first, I think we were actually the first, not one of the first, business associations speaking in favor of legislation on human rights and environmental due diligence, as we really view that we need to have a good mix of both voluntary and mandatory measures, but also we need to have a level playing field created here to further drive positive impact. While we welcome the German Supply Chain Act, we are advocating for legislation at EU level that we view should be closely aligned with UN guiding principles on business human rights and the OECD guidelines for responsible business conduct as the foundation. Before we're going to learn about the possible effects and impacts of the Global Supply Chain Act on the supply chains, I would like to already outline some key implications at a very high level. Impacts beyond Europe, I think that's clear for everyone. The German Supply Chain Act and other upcoming legislations, such as the EU Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, EU CSDDD in short, or the EU Forced Labor Product Ban, will have a profound impact beyond Europe as they target global value change. And by these increasing due diligence obligations or traceability requirements and the need to collaborate within business partners throughout the value chain, there is, I would say, a lot that's going to happen. So even if companies are not directly concerned, changes are that they will be so indirectly because of customer requests, for instance, or new contractual obligations. And it's the leading question. Whenever I'm out there in sourcing countries, they all ask, Linda, what is the impact of that legislation going to be on me as a business partner? And how can I make sure that I will stay viable and credible and can continue doing business within the global value chain? Other key implications are supply chain disruptions. If companies or business partners are not complying with the law, is this going to lead indirectly to them being taken out of the value chain? Won't be able to place a project anymore on the EU market? Will there be potentially liabilities or sanctions being put on companies doing business with business partners there? And what is then the impact indeed on the supply chain and the reliability of the supply chain there? Can we still deliver on time as promised? And then I would say another HR-EDD trend, human rights and environmental issues are intrinsically related. The need to address them holistically is reflected in the latest legislative trends on due diligence legislation. And that's also why we view that within amfori, you need to have a full offering, environmental, social, but also what is that he can do to support you in good governance and showing that you have the right due diligence process in place, that you have the right information to share, that you are able to explain why you made certain decisions, to really focus on the risks that matter most to you as a company. Companies need to be prepared, not only from a compliance point of view, but also because conducting due diligence and acting responsibly is the norm of expected conduct. Also to meet customers, stakeholders, as well as investors' expectations, but also to become frontrunners and capitalize on the business opportunities that the legislation will bring. Think about it as a competitive advantage if you do it right and do it well. So therefore, we encourage our members to make use of our tools, and I already shared them briefly with you, amfori BCI and amfori BPI, to help you identify, assess, and mitigate supply chain risk and track progress. Our supply chain grievance mechanism is important because it helps companies to support, say, providing access to remedy in the global supply chain without having to do it for each and every company themselves. There's many more things that we are offering here, and Erica will outline these later today. I think our commitment to you stands. It's about collaboration with our members. It's about collaboration with our business partners. It's about collaboration with our stakeholders, because that's the only way how we can accelerate positive impact. I would like to conclude with to say that very important here is that building capacity among businesses and with the business partners along the entire global value chain is crucial to carry out effective due diligence and document that we know how to adhere to labor, health, safety, and environmental legislation. Thank you very much. I will hand over now to my colleague Francis, who is moderating today's session. Francis, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Linda, for this great overview of what amfori offers and also the situation in global supply chains, how the legal changes affect companies beyond Germany, but also beyond the EU. Really considering that there's also an EU CSDDD proposal on the horizon that is most likely going to be passed next year. So thank you so much, Linda. I will just hand over straight to Michaela Streibel from the German government's Help Desk for Business and Human Rights, who will really talk about the supply chain knock-on effects of the German Supply Chain Act. Michaela, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thanks also to Linda Kromjong for the opening remarks. I agree as well that collaboration within the supply chain is key to successful implementing due diligence obligations and will probably be the most relevant topic in the context of business and human rights in the next coming years, which is why I'm very happy that I have the chance to speak to you today about how the German Due Diligence and Supply Chains Act creates these effects, and also try to give some advice on how to deal with some of the more difficult effects that are being created. Before I do so, I would like to briefly introduce the German Help Desk on Business and Human Rights to those of you who don't already know us. We're a free of charge advice offer from the German government for businesses and business associations. We in addition to that, provide for training programs, including a free of charge e-learning program. If this is interesting for you, please contact us via email. We can provide you access links to this e-learning, which takes about maybe 1 to 1.5 hours. We also participate in events. We have our own event series and different setups. We try to foster dialogue between different actors, businesses, NGOs, but also political actors, and participate in events organized by other organizations, such as today. And we have a broad spectrum of online tools that are free of charge as well. Our SME Compass is an online guide, not only for SME, but also for companies of all sizes, in my opinion, and has recently been expanded by a second component, the Standards Compass, that enables you to identify how to use standards in the context of the due diligence system, but also to recognize limitations of standards and compare some standards. At the moment, it's possible to compare 20 standards with the tool, but we intend on expanding that to up to 300 standards. Our CSR Risk Checker is a tool with which you can conduct the abstract risk analysis to identify potential risks in supply chains. And our tool Business and Human Rights Navigator addresses 10 human rights topics in the context of business and human rights, and gives advice on how to address them in the due diligence process, but also works a lot with practical examples from other companies on how they address these risks. So if you don't already know these tools, I invite you to have a look. I believe that they can be incredibly helpful. So coming to the next slide, a quick overview. I know these developments are familiar to all of you. I want to quickly show this slide to try to categorize these developments. The standards and regulatory developments on the slides can be broadly categorized into 3 categories. There are some legislative attempts in the context of business and human rights that work with reporting obligations, for example, the CSRD, or the formerly NFRD, but also the UK and Australian Modern Slavery Acts, and then some other laws also have reporting obligations, including the German Due Diligence and Supply Chains Act. Then there's a set of regulatory attempts that provide for due diligence obligations. Another example, of course, is the German Due Diligence in Supply Chains Act, but also the Conflict Minerals Regulations or the UN Guiding Principles, the CSDDD. And then there's a set of legislation that takes a different approach, that works with prohibitions of import, export, and use in the market. These are, for example, the EU proposal on the prohibition of products made in forced labor, and the deforestation regulation, the proposed deforestation regulation. So these are all this is all legislation that is coming in the next couple of years, and that will create different kinds of impacts in the context of business and human rights. And the type that we're looking at today is a due diligence system. Okay, so the effects created by the German Due Diligence in Supply Chains Act stem from the fact that companies obliged by the Act don't only have obligations within their own business operations, but in their supply chains. And in order to comply with their obligations, they will need information and assistance and some sort of collaboration from their suppliers in the different tiers of the supply chain. So a company that falls within the scope of the Act will need information in order to conduct their own risk analysis. They will need at least some sort of collaboration from their business partners in order to implement preventive or remedial measures. And they will need some support to implement the grievance mechanism, or also to design it. They will need information on whom do they need to address, and also how can they reach them. And then it will be very difficult to provide for information, for example, to employees of business partner if they don't consent to that. It is important to keep in mind in this context that for companies who are not obliged under the Act, there's no obligations created by the Act. So there's no obligation to actually collaborate with a customer that falls within the scope of the Act, but obviously refraining or generally showing no willingness to cooperate might create other problems in this context. But it's important to keep in mind that companies outside the scope don't have any obligations under the Act, and then some of the obligations cannot be transferred directly from obliged companies to their business partners, and such a transfer of obligations is actually not intended by the Act. So although the Act intends some sort of a trickle-down effect into the supply chains, it is not intended that obliged companies just completely transfer their own obligations to their suppliers, but instead that they invest into implementing due diligence obligations and then also improving the situation in the countries from which they're sourcing. When we look at the next slide, the important thing to keep in mind when we look at German companies' attempts to transfer obligations to their business partners, we must keep in mind that the German Due Diligence and Supply Chains Act obliges obliged companies to appropriate and effective due diligence, and the appropriate manner and effective manner are the key mechanism with which the threshold of how much companies have to do to fulfill their due diligence obligations is determined. The legislator here has chosen a flexible standard because it would be inadequate to apply the same set of obligations to all companies, to all their business operations, to all the supply chains and all the different business partners, but instead a flexible standard is needed in order to funnel the resources to where they're actually needed. And the appropriate manner is relevant in the context of almost all due diligence obligations. And there's no hierarchy between these criteria, and they have to be considered equally, which means that companies cannot use the criteria as a funnel to first say, okay, we'll look at whom can I influence, and out of the actors that I have an influence on, I will then funnel out those where I expect the most severe violations, and then out of those I'll funnel out those to which I contributed. This would be inadequate in this context. And if we look at the appropriate manner and we ask the question, can obligations merely be transferred from an obliged company to their supplier, who might be themselves maybe a German company who's too small to be within the scope of the Act, or maybe a company who's not situated in Germany, and these also might be smaller companies, they might be bigger companies. It is very clear that a mere transfer of obligations typically will not reach the threshold of acting appropriately in the context of your due diligence obligations. And the other key determinant to figure out whether a company meets a threshold to act in accordance with their due diligence obligations is effectiveness. And this I would like to show you on the second slide. So companies must act appropriately and effectively to fulfill their due diligence obligations. Next slide, please. And if we look at the mere transfer of obligations down into the supply chains, in most cases, this will neither be appropriate in the context of the law, nor will it be effective. So typically, if I don't put in more resources, I cannot expect different results. And I know that many German companies at the moment are trying to attempt to fulfill their obligations by letting their business partners inside and outside of Germany sign code of conducts with which they say, I have my own due diligence system, everything is fine, my risk analysis has said that there's no risks, or they will just say, oblige their business partner, attempt to oblige their business partners to say that they themselves have to comply with the German Due Diligence and Supply Chains Act. And in most contexts, this will neither be appropriate nor effective. And we need to also look at conflicts in reaching different goals with such a behavior. So if we look at the risks that are described, so the protected legal positions that are described by the Act, different human rights and environmental standard protected by the Act, most likely if companies continue with their purchasing practices, with and keep paying the same price for goods, for example, but then also expect their business partners to, on top of providing for the goods, also improve wages, improve environmental standards, and improve health and safety at work, and conduct a due diligence system. Most likely this will not be possible by paying the same purchasing price. And it's different, of course, if we look in a supply chain at different actors. So if a supplier of a German obliged company is a big corporation themselves that are also within the scope, it might be appropriate and effective to just let them certify that they themselves have implemented due diligence system and vouch for them conducting appropriate due diligence. That is fine, but it might also be that the criteria of acting in an appropriate manner might be fulfilled to a different extent by this supplier. And so there might be a gap into which the obliged company needs to step in and support in addressing risks and violations. And this obviously can also happen in a context where the other company, the supplier, is not obliged themselves. But a smaller company outside of Germany that can do a little bit in trying to address risks and violations, but cannot go the whole way, and there maybe the German customer needs to step in with support. So it goes both ways. Meaningful collaboration does not mean that obligations can only be transferred. Next slide, please. I want to highlight one important key concept, one other important key concept of the German Due Diligence and Supply Chains Act, which is the concept of enabling before withdrawal. So the German Due Diligence and Supply Chains Act does not intend that obligations are just transferred and handed down into the supply chains. It also does not oblige companies to refrain from business relationships with difficult suppliers in difficult countries or regions of the world. It does not oblige companies, or does not generally oblige companies, to end these business relationships. In many contexts, I believe this will also not be possible. So there's many resources that are just not available in Germany. And I also don't believe that the competitive advantage of producing in countries of the global south will be completely disappear because of the German Due Diligence and Supply Chains Act. But what the Act obliges companies to is to implement a due diligence system with which they proactively identify and address risks and violations. So work together with their partners instead of terminating business relationships. Obviously, in many contexts, companies, when they look at whether they can or cannot terminate business relationships, they will need to look at the applicable contract law and the contract itself to look at whether it is possible for them to terminate a contractual relationship. And the German Due Diligence and Supply Chains Act cannot oblige companies to stay in contractual relationships, but generally speaking, in most contexts, ending a business relationship is not a measure that ends risks and violations, but typically makes the situation of the people that the German Due Diligence and Supply Chains Act intends to protect, makes the situation even worse. But then obviously there are contexts in which a violation is so severe, there's no mitigating means available, all attempts in trying to improve the situation have not been successful, and there's no other options left. And the violation is so severe that it is intolerable that a German company stays in contact with such a violation, with a business relationship where these violations happen. And in this context, the German Due Diligence and Supply Chains Act requires companies to terminate a business relationship. But again, this is only as a last resort. So collaboration within the supply chain, here a quick overview over the different stages of the supply chain. So we have the indirect supplier at in the deeper supply chain, the direct supplier, which is a direct business partner of an obliged company, and then the own operations of the obliged company. The own operations of the obliged company include subsidiaries inside and outside of Germany if a company exercises a decisive influence over these subsidiaries. So there's another context in which there's knock-on effects of the German Due Diligence and Supply Chains Act. And in this context, it's important to keep in mind that the German Due Diligence and Supply Chains Act has a focus on the first-tier suppliers, the direct suppliers, and creates obligations in relation to the deeper supply chain only when a certain knowledge threshold is reached. It's called substantiated knowledge in the law, and it means that there must be actual indications for violation at an indirect suppliers tier. And this puts the direct supplier of an obliged company in a difficult sandwich position, because they don't only have to deal with requests in relation to themselves, and requests don't only mean requests for information, but also requests for some sort of assistance or collaboration, but also requests in relation to the upstream suppliers and in relation to the direct suppliers. And these direct suppliers then might face inquiries from their business partners again. And what this means in the context of the risk analysis, I'd like to show on the next slide. In the context of the risk analysis, we often get inquiries from companies, or in many consultations we hear from companies that they are getting extensive questionnaires or need to sign code of conducts with which they allow their obliged customer to conduct audits or visit production sites and get insight into documents, and also request information in relation to production processes or in relation to upstream suppliers. And in many cases, this type of information might not be necessary for the purposes of the risk analysis, and also the supplier of the obliged company might have an interest in protecting this information. So companies should be very careful when a customer of theirs requests sensitive information in relation to upstream suppliers, if they worry that they might be circumvented in the supply chain, and also if technical information that is protected is requested. They should be very careful and assess whether this is actually information that is needed for the purposes of the risk analysis. What companies do in many cases is that they let their suppliers sign contractual assurances that they comply with the German Due Diligence and Supply Chains Act, or that there's no risks and violations. In most cases, this doesn't constitute a meaningful contribution to the risk analysis of the obliged company. So in this context, it's helpful maybe for a supplier of a German obliged companies to keep in mind that this might not constitute a meaningful contribution to an appropriate and effective risk analysis, and try to use this in the dialogue with their obliged customer, because it is also in the interests of the German obliged customer to conduct an appropriate and effective risk analysis, because if they don't do so, they might face sanctions. And what's also a topic here, this is actually a topic in relation to all the elements of the due diligence management system, the risk management system described by the Act, is that not only is a mere transfer of obligations not intended by the Act clearly states that companies of a certain size need to implement these measures, and they might also be the ones that have to bear the costs for this. So companies should take a closer look at an appropriate cost and burden sharing. And in the context of the risk analysis, they should look at who bears the costs for audits and what costs arise from these self-declarations and questionnaires. And it cannot be understated how big the bureaucratic efforts are that are created by this extensive, questionnaires, or this practice of many German companies to just send questionnaires to all the direct suppliers. And in this context, obviously, I want to highlight again that the German Due Diligence and Supply Chains Act does not implement a watering can approach. So it does not mean that an obliged company addresses all their suppliers with the exact same questions, but a risk-based approach according to the criteria of the appropriate manner. So look at where are the problems, where have they contributed, where do they have influence, and then target these supply chains. On the next slide, I'd like to give a quick overview, and I know I'm already speaking too long, on collaboration in the context of preventive measures. And in the context of preventive measures, the German Due Diligence in Supply Chains Act actually in text directly relies on the contractual relationship and uses the contractual relationship as a tool to implement preventive measures. So in relation to direct suppliers, it is one of many available preventive measures. These are presumptive examples, so it doesn't mean that all of these have to be done, or that only these can prevent risks, but also other things are possible. But the Act here mentions, you see it on the slide, consideration of standards, inclusion of standards in the contractual relationship, but also things like training and risk-based control measures. And this is something that many companies are doing at the moment, although we have to keep in mind they're doing this sometimes in an extensive and not appropriate way when we look at an appropriate cost burden sharing. But when it comes to trying to address the indirect supplier, again, the German obliged company needs to go through their direct suppliers in trying to implement preventive measures in relation to the deeper supply chain, because they don't have the contact to these actors. They might even not know who they are. They might not have identifiable information. And while in the context of the risk analysis, information on where exactly this indirect supplier is situated, how they can be reached, who they are exactly, might not be necessary for the purposes of risk analysis. This is different in the context of measures, because here we need to actually directly address these actors. And in this context, it might be that different solutions might be available to direct suppliers of German obliged companies. So if they are producing company themselves or provide their own services, they might not have the same fears in revealing who their upstream suppliers are as companies who trade in goods and services. So they might not have a problem in contacting their German customer directly with the upstream supplier where the problem is. But a company who trades might be less willing in doing so. And in this context, it might be an option to try to get into dialogue with the German customer and trying to find a solution that protects the interests of the direct supplier of this German customer sufficiently. So it might be possible to get contractual assurances from the obliged customer that they will not use this information for any other purposes and will not enter into a contractual relationship with his upstream supplier. These might be these contractual assurances might even contain contractual penalties in order to create enough of a protective effect. But it might also be an idea to as the direct supplier of this company, say, okay, they are going to implement measures, but they want the financial support from the actually obliged company in doing so in an appropriate way. This situation is very similar in context of remedial measures, which I'd like to highlight on the next slide. So in relation to remedial measures, this is actually the same problem. So again, the direct supplier of an obliged company is in this sandwich position. In order to implement measures at this tier of this direct supplier, they need to collaborate in some way. They at least need to agree to the obliged company to their measures that they want to implement. But in some cases, they might also have to cooperate to some extent. And if we look at, especially at remedial measures, this is where the topic of appropriate cost burden sharing is most relevant, because remedial measures are typically is the element of the due diligence management system that creates the biggest costs. And if you look at the risks or the protected legal positions described by the Act, you see that many of them connect to legal obligations under national law that such a supplier might have themselves anyways under national law. So if we look at, for example, the obligation to comply with national legislation in relation to health and safety at work, this is an original legal obligation under domestic law of a supplier. At the same time, there is a legal obligation for the German obliged customer to implement measures if such a violation is detected. And then we need to look at how can the costs be shared in an appropriate way. And again, decisive here are the requirements of acting appropriately in accordance with the due diligence obligations. So it might mean in some cases that all of the costs for the measures need to be paid for by the German obliged company if they have the resources, if they have contributed to a big extent, if the violations are severe. So it depends on to what extent these requirements are fulfilled. But it might also mean that the supplier, to some extent, has to cover for the costs as well. And yeah, so this is not a one size fits all. This situation is not always the obliged company is the wrongdoer who is not supporting enough and not paying enough so that standards can be met at their supplier's level. There's also context in which maybe the supplier themselves have contributed to the problem as well because they were not so very inclined in meeting these standards. And so the criteria of the appropriate manner help us in order to find an appropriate cost burden sharing in this context. And similar as in relation to the remedial measures, the direct supplier is in this difficult sandwich position when an obliged company wants to address violations in the deeper supply chain at an indirect supplier's level. So I'm coming finally to my last slide. I'm sorry, this is taking a lot longer than I hoped. So I want to just quickly outline collaboration in the context of grievance mechanisms. And yeah, I hinted at some of these aspects before. So the obliged company first needs information from their suppliers in order to design an appropriate grievance mechanism. They will need information on the persons that might be using the grievance mechanism in order to tailor the system in a way that fits them, and especially in a way that makes the grievance mechanism accessible to these groups. And this might be information that they don't that they can't access themselves easily, but they might rely on information from their suppliers. And again, this difficult sandwich situation of the direct suppliers when information is needed in relation to indirect suppliers that they mediate in this context. But also obliged companies are also obliged under the law to not only design an appropriate grievance mechanism, but also to provide for information to the target group of the grievance mechanism on how the mechanism works and how it can be accessed. And providing this type of information might not be possible without consent of this supplier. And in many cases, employees of suppliers have difficulties in addressing grievance mechanisms of customers of their employer because they don't know who this employer is. So it's possible that obliged companies turn towards their supplier in the context usually of code of conduct and oblige their suppliers not only to help them in providing information to potential users of the grievance mechanism, but also oblige them to, upon request by their employees, reveal who customers of this company are. And lastly, and this is a big topic in the context of grievance mechanisms, and this is also something that obliged companies must take care of under the law. They must provide for adequate protection of confidentiality, but also protection against retaliation or disadvantages for people who are using the grievance mechanism. And in this context, they might need some sort of assistance or at least cooperation from their suppliers. So it is possible that they oblige their supplier to implement safeguarding measures for potential users of the grievance mechanisms. And this can be that, for example, users of a grievance mechanism are protected from being laid off for a certain amount of time, but this also might be that they provide for other forms of protection depending on what the risk scenario is. So if it's a company where there's risks from security providers at the company's level and employees fear physical violence because they access the grievance mechanism, the protection necessary in this context might be very different and might rather be needed in the form of the security providers being instructed in changing how they react in this situation. So this just as a quick overview with way too much time. I'm really sorry, but I hope that I was able to, in a nutshell, describe the very complex effects of the German Due Diligence in Supply Chains Act.
Thank you so much, Michaela. Again, wealth of knowledge, and really glad that we have you here to share all of these obligations and the impacts on the global supply chain of the companies that fall under the law. Also, I think it gets to show that really collaboration along the supply chain is absolutely critical in meeting those obligations. In fact, without it's really not possible, especially when it comes to working with your business partners along the supply chain or value chain to really meet these expectations. But also, of course, other stakeholders, internal stakeholders, buying departments, top management, but also rights holders, of course, which ultimately this law aims to protect. So thanks so much, Michaela, for this great overview. Really, really valuable. We have many questions, like we did in our webinar in December. So we have quite limited time now. I would propose that we extend the Q&A a bit and try to be a bit shorter in the presentations afterwards, like we also did in December. Maybe to start off, if you could give a bit of a reminder as to which companies actually fall under the legislation. This is one of the questions more broadly that was raised in the chat, and then in the Q&A box there was also a question specifically on a German company that is owned by another company that is not German, and the other company does not it's not 100% owned by the German company, but then the German company has 40 employees and the mother company is more than 500 employees and is under the scope of the German Supply Chain Act. So just with that in mind, if you can outline the broader scope of the legislation, and then maybe specifically go into the first question in the Q&A box to apply it directly to that practically.
So the Act applies to companies who are of some sort situated in Germany, or who are German companies of some sort. So there's different variations. So they might have their central administration, principal place of business, administrative headquarters, or statutory seat in Germany, and then must meet a threshold of employees. Oh, I'm really sorry. This is I didn't go on not available. And then they must reach a certain threshold of employees. In Germany, this is 3,000 as of 1st of January 2023, and then the threshold will be lowered to 1,000. Within affiliated enterprises, the employee numbers, but again, employee numbers of German affiliated enterprises in Germany will calculate it into the score of the parent company. But this also only works if this is a German company. So if we have, as an example, a German subsidiary of a foreign company, the foreign company will not fall within the scope of the Act because of this. But it might be that this like German subsidiary has other German subsidiaries, and therefore they reach the threshold. And there's no horizontal adding of employee numbers. So if a foreign subsidiary has 10 foreign company has 10 German subsidiaries of each 500 employees, none of these will fall within the scope.
Great. Thanks for the clarification. Let's move on to the next question that links also to the scope, but more specifically to the tiers of the supply chain that need to be looked at. So how far back in the supply chain does this law reach? Is it just tier 1 or is it the whole value chain?
Yeah, this is a really good question, because of this substantiated knowledge thing and the obligations in the deeper supply chain only arising in case of substantiated knowledge, this creates the impression that obligations only exist in relation to tier 1. But this is actually not correct, because substantiated knowledge is reached relatively easily. It might be because it's a supply in a risk branch in a high-risk country. There's been problems in the past. There's been information from the competent authority or information through the grievance mechanism. This might be enough if it's substantiated. So it might be credible and specific enough to create the impression that there might be a problem, and then obligations under the Act arise. And first, there's the obligation to conduct an ad hoc risk analysis in relation to this actor where the problem is. And so it doesn't mean that if I have, let's say, my tier 5, maybe my tier 5 supplier, I don't actually know who they are because they're so far away from me, but I believe they're tier 5. And I have information that there might be a problem. Let's say I'm sourcing cocoa from West Africa, but there's lots of actors in between. That doesn't mean that I have to analyze all the ones in between, tier 1, 2, 3, and 4. I don't have to do that. I have to actually just conduct a risk analysis in relation to the actor where the problem is. But obviously, this means I have to try to create enough transparency to be actually able to conduct a risk analysis in this context. But we need to keep in mind I can't highlight enough, and I hope this was understandable when I tried to talk about the appropriate manner of acting in accordance with the due diligence obligation, because it means acting in an appropriate manner, and it's due diligence obligations of means and not obligations of results. And the end of appropriate is the impossible. So it cannot be expected of companies to do something that they're not able to. And if they know, oh, it's cocoa from West Africa, but I have no idea where it actually comes from, so I'm at the moment not able to conduct a risk analysis in relation to this potential actor with a potential violation, but I can start on working and trying to get information on how to reach them, and making my supply chain transparent.
Yeah. Thanks, Michaela. Let's move on to the next question. Here it relates to whether a company has to make a comment in the reporting to the BAFA related to operations in countries where conventions that are listed in the German Supply Chain Annex are not ratified.
I mean, the Act describes a risk-based approach, and the appropriate manner is what outlines this risk-based approach. And when we look at ratification of international conventions, or actually just the national law, this might be an important indicator in relation to two of the requirements of the appropriate manner, which is nature and extent of the company's operation. So the general risk, this contains a risk-based element, not only, but also, and also in relation to the violation-based criteria, severity, likeliness of occurrence, and irreversibility of a violation. So the ratification status in national legislation is can be an important indicator, but not only. We have many contexts in which the national law is great and everything has been ratified, but what's lacking is the effective regulatory enforcement, and rights are violated nonetheless. And it might also be scenarios where conventions have not been ratified. I think this is rather unusual, but they might not have been ratified. And nonetheless, this particular human rights risk is not a problem. So it's an important indicator, but not the only one.
Yeah. Next question. Here it's about a small business partner is asked by a bigger company falling under the law to show them the policies that they have in place. For example, in order for the bigger company to be able to prove that they reached out and are able to show mitigating actions. But if this business partner is not able to provide this information, let's say it's a small family-owned company, how do the authorities look at that?
So the small family-owned companies, that, just to clarify, doesn't have any problem with the competent authorities. So they will not be among the companies that are being scrutinized, and they don't need to fear any type of sanction.
Sorry, maybe I didn't.
Yeah, no, I understand correctly, but I'm saying this at first because this is a question that we actually get a lot, despite the scope being relatively clear. And the German obliged company that is sourcing from this supplier, whether or not this supplier not being able in cooperating risk leads to risks, this is a whole different question. So the risk of sanction, a sanction is possible if certain obligations under the Act have been violated, and they can be violated by, for example, not conducting a risk analysis at all, not conducting it appropriately, or not doing it on time. And if they reach out to a supplier and say, I need information about your sub suppliers, and they say, we don't have this, and we cannot give it to you because we don't have the resources to do so. And then the German company says, okay, great, I have asked my direct supplier, they say we can't do it, we're too small, this is my risk analysis in this context, and maybe it's a high risk context. This is not enough from the perspective of the obliged company, because the obliged company has the obligation to conduct a risk analysis. So they need to, when they get this type of feedback, look at, okay, what can I now do if my supplier can't do it and they're actually under no obligation to do so? What can I do to actually conduct the risk analysis in relation to the sub-supplier where the risks might be? How can I enable my supplier to do it themselves? How can I maybe get enough information to do it myself, and look at appropriate cost burden sharing in the context of the appropriate manner? And it's important also to keep in mind that not only must there be a violation of a due diligence obligation to get a sanction, but also there must be neglectful of or intentious behavior. So there's not only the violation of an obligation is not the only requirement for a sanction. And if, for example, a company receives wrong information from a supplier, and they relied on it, and they had no reason to believe that there were any mistakes in this, and this should not lead to a sanction, because there is no intent on negligent behavior. In many cases, though, if we look at the example given by you, for example, where the small supplier can't do anything, you say they don't have the resources, and then the company says, okay, great, this is at least negligence.
Yeah, I think the key word here is really cost burden sharing, because I think we see a lot also, you know, especially SMEs and smaller companies, small family-owned companies that are faced with these rising expectations from their customers. That here really there's an honest and close dialogue and a collaborative approach to working with those, because this is ultimately also one of the principles is not to outsource your responsibility to your suppliers, but to really make sure that you support them rather than you know, squeeze them, let's say, and put them into this sandwich position. And a lot of our members are SMEs, so in that sense, you know, we also want to just encourage this partnership approach between business partners, smaller and bigger companies alike.
Yeah. And I think it's important for this dialogue, or also for actors who support maybe companies on both sides of this dilemma, smaller companies, but also bigger obliged companies. It's very important to provide for information and what is actually required by the law, and just trying to transfer obligations does not, in most cases, does not meet the threshold of acting in an appropriate and effective manner in accordance with the due diligence obligation, and might mean that there was a violation of an obligation, maybe in an intentions or negligent way, and then might actually lead to sanctions. And so this borderline abusive practice of some German bigger companies that I have seen over the last year of just sending out these code of conduct and like, you now do everything, you're getting paid the same amount of money, and you now guarantee that everything is fine. This is actually very risky for the obliged companies to do so. And this is also something that smaller companies can use in this dialogue, trying to inform them on actually what is actually required by the law, and how can we now, as a next step after we recognize that this is not required by the law and is actually an illegal behavior, how can we now meaningfully cooperate in this?
Yeah, very important. Okay, next question here related to own operations. So how much focus is expected to be placed on the own operations of a company falling under the law? And are such companies, for example, allowed to prioritize direct suppliers if the risks are expected to be higher there? And yeah, I'm assuming risk-based approach would indeed, if there's an internal risk analysis has been conducted and you see that your priority risks certainly are not there, but in your direct supplier, then I would say yes. The answer is yes to this. Michaela, I don't know if you want
absolutely.
something.
I mean, the answer to all the questions is always the appropriate manner. So it's a bit repetitive, but this is actually the answer to most of these questions, and also to this one. I mean, if you see risks in your own operations or violations, and you prioritize them according to the criteria of the appropriate manner, then you can obviously act there as well. And if you don't, then you might not have to. The important difference between own operations and the supply chain is that in own operations, companies actually have an obligation to guarantee. So that there's not only the obligation of means, but actually an obligation of guarantee, because or obligation of result, because you're not only obliged to due diligence, but also you're the primary responsible actor to provide for operational health and safety, to make sure there's no child labor and so on. So all these obligations are not only addressing the company as due diligence obligations, but also as primary obligations.
Indeed, yeah. Then here's a question on if an invoice with an external company or a service provider equals a direct supplier.
Yeah, I mean, the invoice is an indicator for there being a direct contractual relationship, and the different stages of the supply chain, direct, indirect, are determined by the contractual relationship. It might not only be suppliers, actually it might also be service providers, despite the terminology. And a contractual relationship doesn't mean that there has to be a contract as a piece of paper. All of us conduct contracts all the time. If I buy a snack at a bakery, there's no written sales agreement, yet there's a sales contract, and this is important to keep in mind. So even if you don't have a written contract, and there might not even be an invoice, you might have a direct legal relationship. In business operations, obviously, mostly contracts are written down, and there might be invoices, but even if there's not so, an invoice is a good indicator for there being a contractual legal relationship.
Indeed. Okay, we have plenty more questions. They keep coming, so I think we need to slowly draw this Q&A to a close. We'll move on to the next presentations. However, what I would suggest, and Michaela, if that's okay with you, like we've done in the past webinar, Michaela may be able to provide written answers now to the questions that are still in the Q&A box, while we move on to the next presentation of Erica, and then hopefully we will also be able to answer any other questions that may still come up afterwards, and share the Q&A with you. Maybe just one comment that I want to raise, since it's not a question, doesn't require much discussion, from Peter McAllister from the Ethical Trade Initiative, who's pointing out that safeguarding provision should be stronger to ensure that the safety of rights holders is first and foremost, given the realities we see in too many workplaces. There's not mention of representation by unions, for example. This cannot be left to the employer in many cases. It's a very, very important point. So I wanted to indeed point that out. And I think, generally, indeed, I think we need to see how we can collaborate more effectively with a broader stakeholder context. But I leave it there. Erica, please, moving on to your presentation on the HRDD context and the amfori solutions that we provide in this regard. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Francis. I would jump over the first slide and I will directly go to the second one. Yeah, this one. So we have a little bit more time for Q&A. I see there's a lot of questions. So I'm going to jump to directly the practicalities, the practical tools and services amfori has. I think it's probably the most important point. So very practically, how can amfori help company in accessing relevant data? So that's the first question I wanted to cover here. And I would focus here on different amfori tools to help companies in collecting, processing, and integrating external and internal data into their due diligence process. So by external, I mean information which will impact your organization, your operation. So we're having an outside-in perspective. And here, internal data means the data from your own operation or your own supply chain, here specifically your supply chain, which would have a potential effect. And again, here we're mainly looking at potential negative impact on people and environment. So the first type of external information which are monitored and made available to amfori members are the legislation monitoring through the amfori advocacy service, and the current landscape being extremely complex and which could be a little bit overwhelming. What we have is a team who are looking at those information, who are looking at those legislation, processing it, summarizing it, but most of all, they're making it very concrete, and they will look at the implication for businesses. So that's a first level of information, of data that can be integrated in your due diligence process. The second type of external information are risk data. Risk data through our country risk classification tool accessible on the amfori Insight. The current classification is displaying 6 indicators from the World Bank, which are related to country governance. In Q2 this year, we will be releasing the ESG Risk Identification Index, which will centralize more than 20 topical indicators per country, again, related to social, environmental, and governance issue. So I'm taking the example of environmental. There will be indicators on climate change, biodiversity, water stress. On the social side, there will be indicators on children's rights, child labor, fair remuneration, freedom of association. And on the governance side, there will be indicators on conflict and environmental and human rights treaties. So internal data, as I said previously, is your own operation, and more specifically here on your supply chain, where the starting point is the supply chain mapping functionality on the sustainability platform. From that point, different ways to collect data. The collaborative platform allows member company to access basic information on business partners, so on your production sites, on the structure, on the sector, sometimes on the product. And because of the collaborative nature of the platform, if a monitoring activity was conducted at this production site, you will directly have access to available data. So audit data, monitoring data, continuous improvement, self-assessment, and so on. And then a third way to get data in is through data exchange. So from the amfori platform to external platform, and the other way around from, for example, external organization with whom we are sharing production site data. So for instance, amfori is collaborating with Open Supply Hub, previously named Open Apparel Registry, to enhance transparency and exchangeability of data in supply chain. Next slide. So next slide. Thanks. So now you're going to ask, I have this information, I've processed and integrated them into my due diligence and decision-making process, but so now what? What can I do? So taking action is not an easy step. Okay? And amfori believe in the collective action and joint effort. It's a membership association, as Linda defined it earlier. But whether you want to prevent, mitigate, or remediate, a different type of action will be needed, and different level of effort will be required, of course. So at amfori, once a company knows where are its potential risks, through the data collection exercise, but also through your internal processes, we first encourage knowledge dissemination. So to prevent and sometimes mitigate risk, knowledge, awareness raising, training is key. So therefore, the amfori Academy aims at reaching a wide audience, of course, company, but different department, different internal stakeholders within the company. So the awareness is widely shared. Different department, meaning purchasing, not only CSR, so could be purchasing, could be legal, could be your colleagues in marketing and so on. Second audience, of course, SMEs. And in the Academy, we do have now a human rights journey and environmental journey to really help guiding companies with maybe less resources into, let's say, a guided learning path. There's practical webinars, but also practical workshops that are face-to-face workshop conducted in different countries that really help, again, companies who does not necessarily have experts in getting into a topic. And then business partners, so production sites. And so that's a very important point for us, that the Academy is accessible for free. If they are in our system, they can have access to all training material in the Academy, but also to face-to-face workshop in local languages. And so we are talking here about our main sourcing countries. So of course, China, Bangladesh, India, Turkey, but we're expanding, and we constantly expand our offer into other countries. Another functionality is the continuous improvement functionality on the amfori platform that allow company to directly support business partners, so your production site in your supply chain, in the corrective action plan, to work more on the mitigation side. And then last but not least, when a negative impact have occurred and immediate remediation is needed, collective remediation can be done through different protocols. So we have the zero tolerance protocol and the amfori supply chain grievance mechanism, which are two different channels to raise alert, but the remediation protocol is based on the same principle of joint action and joint effort. Collaboration within amfori membership is key in both those protocols, but collaborating with external organizations is also essential. So I haven't mentioned it here, but for the supply chain grievance mechanism, we're collaborating with Fairware and PST, and the next panelist will tell you a little bit more. But it's very important for us that we are fitting within an ecosystem. So the intention is not to do everything, of course, but to collaborate as much as possible where we have strengths and where we don't have strengths, basically. So that's a glimpse of few practical tools and for we have to support companies in fulfilling the legislation requirement. I hope this was clear and informative, and happy to answer to any questions.
Thank you so much, Erika. Let's move straight on in the interest of time to Isabel Reichenbach, who will also give an overview of the tools of the German PST. So Isabel, please, floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. And hello, I hope you can all hear me. Well, thanks again also to amfori, for co-hosting this webinar with us, and maybe just jump to the next slide in the interest of time. In the beginning, you heard a bit from Linda about amfori. So just very quickly here, for those of you who don't know the Partnership for Sustainable Textiles, we are a multi-stakeholder initiative with around 130 members from business, non-governmental organizations, standard organizations, and the the German federal government. And basically what we do in our work is we focus on 3 key elements. And the first one I'm going to talk about now a little bit, which focuses on the implementation of due diligence. So maybe next slide already. We in the partnership, we have our own public reporting process on the implementation of due diligence obligations. It's the so-called review process. And what we do there is basically provide our members with an infrastructure on their due diligence obligations. It focuses really on the risk analysis. So our members are asked to analyze the 11 sector risks that you can also see on the slide here, to prioritize and then to take remedial and preventative measures based on that risk analysis. And along that process, we in the PST, we offer our members guidance on how to fulfill their due diligence obligations. So basically, this is also an invitation from maybe some of you who are more interested and also want to kind of work in that infrastructure, to reach out to us if you want to get into the topic, and if you want to report on your due diligence, how you fulfill your due diligence obligations, and then also benefit from the guidance we provide. I'm going to talk about that a bit after. Then maybe next slide. Focused joint action. I think we have heard today in all the presentations that collaboration is key. And I mean, here we talk strongly, or we have a strong focus the due diligence or the Supply Chain Act. But I think in the end, and this is what my colleague Andreas also said in the webinar in December, is what we want to achieve is positive change on the ground. So one of our focus is on joint action. What we do in the partnership is we implement joint projects on the ground, and basically supporting our members in setting up these projects that also have a link up to their risk analysis. And what maybe makes these projects interesting is that here many members from the partnership, they work together, so from different stakeholder groups, and they are implemented in production countries, but then also they are eligible for public sector contribution. So this is also, I think, an interesting aspect and one of our focuses for this year. Then next slide, Erica, she has talked a bit about grievance mechanisms and remedy, and she's already mentioned that we're collaborating on that topic. Also, in a nutshell, what I want to tell you is that we do not operate our own cross-company grievance mechanism, because we don't want to add to that fragmented system that we see at the moment, but we collaborate with specifically with amfori and also Fairware, but then also with other initiatives, including FLA, also ETI. So this is based also here, we want to collaborate with others and want to encourage and support our members in joining forces rather than creating another mechanism in the current system. And then last but not least, because I mentioned that also earlier, one of the what we do is we focus on the whole aspect of learning and dialogue. So members to the partnership, they benefit from a great amount of trainings, guidelines, but also peer learning on different aspects of due diligence obligations, but also on concrete topics. And I just named a few here. So we do training on purchasing practices. We have guidance, but also a tool on risk analysis. We have an incident list, peer learning on sustainable packaging, trainings on climate actions. So basically with these offerings, we try to support our members and especially our member companies to fulfill their due diligence obligations. And looking at the time, I'll leave it with that and hand over back to you, Francis.
Thank you so much, Isabel. Really great to see all these engagement opportunities that the PST provides, and also looking forward to continue our collaboration on various in the various areas. Maybe just one thing that I wanted to point out, that's an answer that Michaela drafted in response to a comment from one of the smaller companies present also in the webinar today. And specifically, the comment reads, for us smaller companies, the real business life looks entirely different. Our customers, which are all obliged to transfer their obligations to our side, we have to cover the cost, and bureaucracy is tremendously increasing, not only by this legislation, but also by the deforestation regulation, packaging, recycling act, and so on and so forth. So I think this is really a reality that many companies face that supply to bigger companies. And I think here the answer of Michaela deserves a bit of attention. So Michaela also pointed to the fact that the BAFA is currently working out some guidance also for both companies' obligations that are directly affected by the law, and the role of their suppliers, and also with the note that the bigger companies can be sanctioned in case they really just outsource their obligations to their suppliers. So this is an important note. That publication will come out in April or May. So we'll also closely monitor this and continue the engagement with the German government's help desk to understand how also amfori can support in fostering a dialogue and collaborative collaboration between the different business partners. And on that note, and also referring to what Isabel just said on purchasing practices, there's also currently a pilot going on in the textile sector, the Common Framework on Responsible Purchasing Practices, which is really serves as a great basis for understanding your purchasing practices performance, if you will, and how responsible your purchasing practices are. And I encourage also bigger companies to have a look at that to understand where they stand. Even though it's targeted for textile and garments, it's many of the principles are really transferable to other sectors as well. It's a framework that was launched, I believe, last year in the summer. We were involved together with Fairware and ETI that very much drove this, also with the German PST involvement and other MSIs that were part of this effort to create that framework. And now it's being tested and piloted with involvement of various companies. But purchasing practices generally is increasing in importance. Also looking at the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, but also the German Supply Chain Act, which makes some clear references to purchasing practices. So I think that's an important point that we shouldn't forget, because in the end of the day, the purchasing practices really matter when it comes to driving a progress on social and environmental performance in the global value chains. So we have still so many questions, but we also have some closing remarks still from Linda Schrammel. I will see what we can still address. Maybe one or two questions we can still try to address now. But one of them, for instance, relates to systemic issues on certain countries. It's mentioned decent working hours in China being a very systemic problem. And indeed, there are some limitations as to what a company can do to bring about change on very systemic issues. And I think in that context, cultural specificities and also geographical issues need to be taken into account and will be taken into account also by the enforcing agencies and authorities. And that's an important point to remember. But we will not be able to address all of the questions now. So Michaela has already given answer to some of them. But at this point, I think we'll have to close the Q&A, hand over to Linda for her closing remarks. And then Linda, please, the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you, Francis. Can you hear me? Yeah, I think, yeah, should be okay, right? Okay, thanks a lot for the opportunity to join this very interesting webinar, and also for giving this closing remarks. So it was said, my name is Linda, and I'm heading the textile partnerships. And I really would like to thank amfori and also Francis for organizing this webinar, as well as Michaela from the help desk and the other partners for their input. I think we all agree that lots of discussions on the German Supply Chain Act circle around those to whom the law directly applies. But I think we also can agree that it is equally important to include those companies who will most likely receive requests from their larger German customers. And I think today we have heard what is expected from these companies. And I think we also have heard about the knock-on effects of the German Supply Chain Act, and especially with regard to risk analysis, preventative and remedial measures, and as well as the grievance mechanism. And I think it also, the webinar somehow highlighted how initiatives such as amfori and also the textile partnerships and others provide companies with tool and guidance on how to meet their due diligence obligations. And at this point, it seems very important to me, and I really would like to stress the power of the collaboration which is taking place also in these initiatives such as amfori and also the PST, and also within other initiatives and jointly with other partners. And especially when we look at our main goal, which is to contribute and achieve to positive change on the ground. At this point of time, I really would like to emphasize that this regulatory environment and further development in the future should be seen as an opportunity to push for this positive change. And we aim to prepare and guide our members through this changing environments. I really would like to thank you for your attention today and your participation at the very fruitful webinar. I hope it was insightful for you, and I hope to see you soon again. And so I close. Francis, do you yes, want to take over?
I would like to just quickly also point out some key dates coming up. So we have also our next webinar in the series, which will focus specifically on risk analysis under the German Supply Chain Act. So we'll really dive deep into this particular and very important step. And then also, of course, provide an overview of how amfori and the German PST can support in this regard. And then also, of course, our annual conference, which is coming up on the 6th and 7th of November in Berlin. It's actually the 20-year celebration of amfori BSCI. And on that note, yeah, would all be happy to see many of you in the webinar on the 27th of April, and of course at our conference in Berlin. I would like to thank all the speakers very, very much. It was really very, very rich content-wise, and a lot of questions, a lot of interest. So it's very encouraging to see that you know, this webinar series resonates so much. I think there's quite a few problems or also challenges that companies face in the implementation of this legislation. And of course, we're here to support. We want to really make sure that our platform and of course the tools of the German PST that are there can support you in closing knowledge gaps, in tackling due diligence implementation more effectively in a collaborative manner, and to really also be more effective in ultimately addressing negative or adverse impacts in the global supply chain. And this is ultimately what we're trying to achieve. So I'd like to thank you all very, very much for your attendance, and we will get back to you with the slides and the recording, which many of you asked whether this will be available, and indeed it will be. So we'll share that afterwards together with the Q&A write-up. And then I thank you all very, very much, and look forward to our next webinar on the 27th of April, and hope to see many of you there. Thank you very much.